The night was so still that even the mountains seemed to be holding their breath. In the faint light spilling from the cabin window, two figures rested on a faded plaid shirt near the hearth. A silver-gray Maine Coon named Maple, and a young bobcat with tawny spots and eyes that flickered like dying embers. Their fur touched, their breathing matched, one wild and one tame. From the doorway, Calvin stood frozen, unsure if what he saw was a miracle or madness. Outside, snow whispered across the deck, settling in soft waves over the pine rails. The old radio hummed low in the background, a country song about coming home to nothing. And still, the two animals didn't move. The bobcat's paw, rough, scarred, trembling, rested over Maple's chest. A gesture so simple, so impossible, it felt like nature had rewritten its own rules. Calvin exhaled, the fog from his breath rising like smoke. He hadn't planned on keeping the animal this long. He hadn't planned on much of anything, really. But grief and kindness often make their own plans, don't they? When you've held enough dying things in your hands, sometimes you'll do anything to keep one alive. He leaned against the doorframe, his mind drifting back to the night it all began. The call from a stranger, the rain-soaked drive into the hills, and the sound he still couldn't forget. A cry that wasn't quite wild and not quite domestic, echoing through the dark like something lost between two worlds. Back then, he had no idea how far that cry would reach into his life. He didn't yet know that it would pull him toward a broken kitten, a test of faith, and a lesson about love that wasn't meant to be kept. The fire popped. Maple stirred but didn't move away from the bobcat.
Hey, come on out. It's okay.
Calvin rubbed his tired eyes. He told himself this was temporary, that the forest would call the animal back when it was ready. But part of him already knew the truth, the kind you only whisper to yourself on quiet nights. That sometimes love is not about possession. It's about the stillness between two breaths, where fear and trust finally meet. And just like that, the memory began to unfold. The phone ringing that rainy afternoon, the way the static carried a voice that would change everything. It was the kind of call that made your stomach twist before you even answered, the kind that always came in the middle of something ordinary. That afternoon, Calvin had been fixing the hinge on the back porch, grumbling about the cold seeping into his knees. His phone buzzed once, twice, then settled into silence, only to light up again a moment later. He wiped his hands on his flannel and picked up. "Yeah, this is Calvin." A woman's voice, tight, measured, like someone trying very hard not to panic. "My name's Lydia. I got your number from the feed store in Jasper. Said you used to do rescue work with wildlife." Used to. Calvin felt that phrase hit like a bruise. "I still do some. What's going on?" She hesitated. "There's a place off Hollow Ridge Road. Old hunting cabin. Belongs to a guy named Ray Thorne. I think he's keeping wild cats. Bobcats. In cages. And something's wrong. Real wrong." Calvin's mind started running ahead of her words. Hollow Ridge was 6 miles past the old fire tower. No one lived out there full time. A place for old hunters, loners, or folks trying to stay off the radar. "You see them yourself?" he asked. "I did. 2 grown ones, maybe more. And a couple little ones. They looked bad. One was just laying there, not moving. I was hiking with my dog. He caught the scent. We weren't supposed to be that close, but I couldn't walk away." Calvin felt the porch hinge problem melt from his mind like snow on a stovetop. There were legal channels for this. Fish and Wildlife, the sheriff. But he knew how slow the system moved, and he'd seen enough red tape wrapped around dead animals to know he couldn't wait. "I'll head out now," he said. "You got a map pin or something?" She texted the location. He didn't bother changing out of his work jeans. He grabbed his med bag, a flashlight, and an old wool blanket from the back of the truck. Nora was out in town. Pottery class, he thought. So he left a note on the kitchen counter. Just 4 words. The man who owned the place stumbled out of the trailer just as Calvin was inspecting the broken kitten. He reeked of sour whiskey and rot, and wore a torn flannel that hung off him like a loose flag. "You ain't supposed to be back here," he grunted, scratching his belly through the fabric. "You one of them animal cops?" Calvin stood slowly, planting himself between the cages and the man. "No, I'm someone who gives a damn," he said quietly, voice even but full of weight. The man shrugged, unconcerned. "Cats get mean sometimes. They tore into each other. Happens. Nothing I could do. Happens when you cram wild things into cages not fit for a rabbit hutch." The man took a step back at Calvin's tone. He could see something behind the vet's eyes, something not worth arguing with. "I'm taking the injured one," Calvin said. "You can either hand me the key, or I'll take a crowbar to this lock and call the sheriff after." That sobered the man a bit. He muttered under his breath, but tossed a ring of grimy keys toward Calvin, who caught them without breaking eye contact. Moments later, the cage creaked open. The smallest of the kittens lay like a heap of soaked leaves. His flank was split open, ribs rising shallowly under a coat smeared in dried blood. One leg twisted in a way no leg should. But there was still breath, fragile but steady. Calvin moved like someone handling glass. He slid the wool blanket under the kitten and wrapped him tight, his hands cradling the bundle as if it contained fire. The animal let out a whisper of sound. Not pain exactly, more surrender. In the truck, Calvin placed the bundle on the passenger seat and started the engine. The heater clicked on, blowing lukewarm air across the dashboard. He glanced at the kitten. "We're gonna try, little guy, but you gotta meet me halfway." The drive home was a blur of cold light and winding roads. Calvin drove one-handed, the other resting lightly on the bundle. Every bump in the road felt like a threat. Every turn a test of fate. By the time he reached the cabin, night had settled in like a heavy coat. He pulled into the driveway, gravel crunching beneath the tires. The porch light flicked on automatically, casting long shadows across the snow-dusted steps. Nora opened the door before he could knock. She took one look at his face and stepped aside without a word. On the kitchen table, Calvin unwrapped the blanket. Nora sucked in a breath when she saw the state of the kitten. Her hands instinctively reached for the medical kit they kept under the counter. "I'll get the sterile pads." "You need gloves?" she asked, already moving. "Yeah, and the suture kit. His side's torn up. We don't have much time." For the next 3 hours, the cabin became a battlefield against death. Calvin stitched while Nora cleaned. They warmed fluids on the stove, fed him formula a drop at a time, wrapped the tiny leg with the gentleness of surgeons, even though it shook in their hands. They didn't talk much, just exchanged nods, short instructions, and glances that said everything words couldn't. Finally, as the fire burned low and the clock neared midnight, the kitten let out a quiet sigh. His breathing slowed but steadied. His body, once curled tight with pain, relaxed slightly in the warmth of the fleece nest they'd built. Calvin sank into the armchair, wiped his hands on his jeans, and stared into the fire. Nora curled beside him, eyes locked on the tiny bundle they'd wrestled back from the edge. "What'll we call him?" she asked softly. Calvin didn't answer right away. He looked over at the kitten, so small, so impossibly wild, and yet still here. "Bodhi," he said at last, "means awakening. Seems right." And in the shadows near the hallway, another set of eyes watched. Maple, their aging Maine Coon, sat silently, her tail curled around her paws, ears twitching with interest. She didn't make a sound, not yet, but the story between them was already beginning. The following days moved like fog through the pines, quiet, fragile, and slow. Bodhi lay curled in a fleece-lined crate by the fireplace, flanked by hot water bottles and the faint scent of pine sap from the fresh-cut wood pile. His breathing remained shallow, but each hour he stayed alive felt like a small revolution. Calvin barely left the cabin. He took to sleeping in the recliner beside the crate, waking every 2 hours to check Bodhi's vitals, clean his wounds, and feed him drops of goat's milk formula warm to just the right temperature. Nora, ever the quiet force beside him, managed the house, the phone calls, and the long silences that often came when healing felt more like a prayer than a science. Maple watched it all from a distance. At first she perched high on the bookshelf, tail flicking, ears poised. Her gaze was steady, not fearful, not curious. Something deeper, something almost ancient. She didn't approach the crate for 2 full days. It was early on the 3rd morning when she made her move. Calvin had stepped outside to split kindling. Nora was refilling the syringe feeder in the kitchen. Maple moved with deliberate grace, descending from the armrest of the couch to the hardwood floor, her large paws soundless against the grain. She padded up to the crate, paused, then sat. Inside, Bodhi stirred. A faint noise, half whimper, half growl, escaped him. His nose twitched, catching her scent. His eyes fluttered open just a sliver, enough to see the shape of another creature watching. Maple lowered herself slowly onto her belly. She didn't blink, didn't growl. She began to purr, not the casual, contented thrum of a lazy afternoon, but something deeper, resonant. It filled the room like low thunder, steady and protective. When Calvin came back inside, he froze mid-step. Maple was pressed up against the crate now, her side flush with the mesh, her eyes half-lidded in a trance-like state. Bodhi had somehow scooted closer to her, his bandaged body trembling but reaching. Their fur, though separated by a wall of wire, was nearly touching. Calvin said nothing. He simply set down the kindling and watched. From that point on, Maple became a fixture. She stayed close, rarely leaving her vigil. When Bodhi whimpered in his sleep, she purred louder. When he cried out from phantom pain, her tail would twitch once, then settle again. Nora, who believed in energy more than most, said it was as if Maple was pouring something invisible into him, something medicinal, something maternal. By the 5th day, Bodhi took his first unassisted steps. It wasn't graceful. His bandaged leg dragged awkwardly, and his muscles shook from the effort. But he made it 3 steps out of the crate before collapsing into Maple's side. She didn't flinch, just reached her head down and began to groom him. Her tongue rasped gently across his matted fur, lingering on the scars, cleaning the places he couldn't reach. She licked with the patience of an old soul, each stroke a wordless vow. Nora crouched nearby, filming on her phone in silence. Not for likes or views, but because moments like this had to be remembered, had to be believed. "I think she's choosing him," she whispered to Calvin later that night. "It's not possible," he said quietly, though even as he said it, he felt the doubt in his own voice. "Nature doesn't always follow the rules we think it should," she replied. The fire popped. Outside, the wind moved through the trees like breath, and inside, on that old plaid blanket draped across the living room floor, a housecat curled her body protectively around a wild creature, a bobcat without a mother, a kitten who should have died in the dark, but didn't. By the end of the 2nd week, the rhythm of the house had shifted around Bodhi's slow recovery. The television stayed off. The phone rang less. Meals were simpler, quieter. The world outside the cabin, taxes, errands, deadlines, all faded into something less urgent, less real. What mattered now was healing, and watching a bond form that no one could quite explain. Bodhi had begun to walk in short, clumsy bursts, his gait uneven, but his spirit determined. His fur had softened under Maple's constant grooming, and the hard edges in his cries had dulled. Where once there had been only fight or flight, there was now curiosity. He sniffed at shadows, followed light beams on the floor, and even let out the occasional chirp. That strange vocalization bobcats make when they're content but alert. Maple, for her part, had assumed full command of her new role. She herded Bodhi with tail flicks, nudged him back from the fireplace when he got too close, and even stood between him and the vacuum cleaner, the sworn enemy of all cats. with regal indignation. But it wasn't just caretaking. It was teaching. One morning, Calvin watched from the hallway as Bodhi pounced at Maple's swaying tail. His movements were clumsy, exaggerated. He growled, more cub than cat, and swiped with extended claws, catching Maple's cheek. For a moment, time froze. Then, Maple let out a low, guttural yowl. Not from pain, but from authority. She stared Bodhi down, ears forward, body tense but still. Bodhi flattened to the floor, uncertain. Then, slowly, Maple raised a massive paw and bopped him on the nose. Not hard, not cruel. Just enough to say, "That's not how we do things here." Bodhi blinked. A long, slow blink. The feline equivalent of an apology. Maple blinked back. Calvin found himself holding his breath. It happened again that evening. A bite that was too firm, a growl that bordered on feral. Each time, Maple corrected him, never with violence, always with calm dominance. Over the next several days, Bodhi adjusted. He learned to retract his claws during play, to chirp instead of snarl, to understand the unspoken language of boundaries and trust. "You seeing this?" Nora asked one evening as they sat on the edge of the couch, watching the two curl around each other on the rug. "Yeah," Calvin replied, his voice quiet. "She's civilizing him." Nora smiled softly. Maybe she's reminding him he's not just wild, not anymore. But even as the days turned gentler, a tension was building beneath the surface. Calvin felt it when he cleaned Bodhi's splint for the 5th time in a week. When he changed the crate lining and noticed how fast the kitten was gaining weight, how quickly his muscles were returning. He's healing too well, Calvin thought. Too fast. That night, while the fire cracked and the snow fell in lazy spirals, Calvin sat with Maple curled in his lap and Bodhi snoring softly near the hearth. He looked at the both of them, a queen and her cub, and felt something sharp twist in his chest. They weren't meant to be permanent. Bodhi belonged to the trees, the cliffs, the wind through the high grass, not to walls and wool blankets. But the thought of separating them, of undoing whatever strange magic had brought them together, felt like pulling stars out of the sky. Later, as he stood at the window, watching the dark wrap around the trees, Calvin whispered aloud to the glass, not expecting an answer. "How do you let go of something you saved?" Behind him, Maple stirred. She padded over, sat at his feet, and pressed her head into his leg. A slow, deliberate movement. And Calvin knew. The answer wasn't now. Not yet. Snowfall came late that year. The hills were slow to surrender to winter. But when it finally arrived, it came with hush and heaviness. The world outside the cabin turned white, soft, and still, as if nature herself were holding her breath. Inside, Bodhi had grown noticeably stronger. His limp had lessened, the splint came off, and his coat now shimmered with a healthy sheen under the firelight. He was taller too, more sure of his body. The tufts on his ears had darkened. His tail moved with the twitchy confidence of a wild thing born to run. But he didn't run, not yet. Instead, he followed Maple. He trailed her through the house like a shadow. If she moved to the kitchen window, he sat beneath it. If she perched on the back of the couch, he climbed clumsily after her. If she slept, he curled beside her, one paw always touching. A silent tether. Calvin watched this growing dependence with mixed emotions. The part of him that had spent decades mending broken creatures swelled with pride. But another part, the part that knew how nature worked, began to whisper doubts. "He's imprinting on her," he told Nora one evening. She was sitting at the table, turning over a worn photograph in her hands, black and white, a memory from years back. A younger Calvin, standing beside a wolf pup, his face lined with both hope and uncertainty. Nora didn't look up. "She's giving him what he missed. It's not wrong. It's not sustainable either." The words hung heavy in the room. Later that night, Calvin stood on the porch while Bodhi slept, watching as faint stars pierced through the snow clouds. He thought about the past, about the fox they'd tried to raise once, who refused to be rewilded, about the red-tailed hawk who beat her wings against the walls until she bloodied them, desperate for open skies. Each time, it ended the same, heartbreak. But Bodhi, he was different. Or maybe Calvin just needed him to be. The next morning, Calvin was splitting firewood when the phone rang inside. He didn't rush. Calls were rare but rarely urgent. Still, when he stepped back into the cabin and saw the look on Nora's face, his breath caught. "Who was it?" he asked. She didn't answer right away, just handed him the phone, the screen still lit. A wildlife sanctuary, Highland Pines Rehabilitation Center, upstate, 2 hours away. They'd seen the footage Nora had posted, the quiet clips of Maple and Bodhi curled together, of the grooming, the corrections, the play. They weren't calling to scold or intervene. They were calling because they had something to share. A Bobcat kitten was rescued, the woman on the line had said. A male, same age range, malnourished but recovering. Calvin sat down hard in the chair by the fire. "From where?" he asked. She told him. A remote stretch of land that matched exactly where Bodhi had been found. Same property, same week. The timelines overlapped. "We thought he was the only survivor," she said quietly. "We named him Asher. He's skittish, but he's fighting. We were told there were more, but we assumed the worst. Are you saying—" "I have his brother," Calvin replied, voice raw. Silence. And then, "You need to bring him." That night, Calvin didn't sleep. Maple paced the cabin, sensing the tension in the air. Bodhi, unaware, chirped at moths dancing along the window pane. Nora brought Calvin a cup of tea and sat beside him on the couch. "We always knew this day would come," she said. He nodded slowly. "But I didn't know it would feel like losing a part of myself." Outside, the snowfall had slowed to a gentle drift. The world waited, and somewhere beyond the trees, a brother Bodhi had forgotten was waiting too. The sun barely crested over the ridge that morning when Calvin placed the travel carrier on the kitchen floor. It was larger than most, lined with the same old plaid shirt Bodhi had claimed weeks ago, still faintly scented with wood smoke and cedar oil. Bodhi sniffed it, circled it once, and let out a low, questioning chirp. Maple sat on the windowsill, watching. Nora knelt beside the carrier, folding a blanket around the edges. "He'll be safe. The place is clean, spacious, and they know what they're doing." Calvin didn't answer. His jaw clenched. He checked the latches on the carrier again, a third time, then stood, running his fingers through his beard. The drive to the sanctuary was quiet. They'd loaded the truck before dawn. Bodhi rested in the back seat, chirping occasionally at the rustling trees. Maple, in a rare exception to her usual habits, rode up front on Nora's lap. Her green eyes locked on the road ahead. Calvin glanced over. "She insisted on coming." Nora smiled faintly. "She knows this is big." The road wound through the hills, past frozen creeks and bare-limbed trees that rattled like bones in the wind. Each mile carried a heavier silence. Calvin's grip tightened on the steering wheel, white-knuckled by the time they pulled into the long gravel driveway. The sign read, "Highland Pines Wildlife Sanctuary." A woman in a thick canvas jacket met them at the gate. Her name was Mira. She had windburned cheeks and calloused hands that felt solid and kind when she shook Calvin's. "He's doing okay," she said softly, as they walked toward the enclosure. "Still skittish. Doesn't eat unless we leave the food and walk away. Sleeps curled tight in the corner. But his vitals are strong." The enclosure sat against a backdrop of pines and rock outcroppings, spacious, layered with logs, brush, and climbing structures. A small cave sat at one end, half hidden by snow-covered branches. Mira paused at the fence. He's in there now. Hasn't come out yet this morning. Calvin opened Bodhi's carrier slowly. The bobcat stepped out cautiously, his ears high, nose twitching at the unfamiliar scents. He didn't bolt, didn't crouch, just stared. Then the wind shifted. A darker shape moved within the cave. A pair of golden eyes blinked. The second bobcat stepped into the light. Smaller, leaner, but unmistakably related. Same spotting, same tail flick, same cautious strength. Bodhi froze. His head tilted. Then he let out a sound Calvin had never heard from him. A soft chuff, deep in the throat, more breath than voice. The other bobcat chuffed back. And just like that, something ancient clicked into place. They approached slowly, circling each other, tails flicking. Then they touched noses, brief, electric. And in the next moment, they were rolling through the snow, not fighting, but wrestling like cubs who remembered the other's scent. Nora clutched Calvin's sleeve, tears already on her cheeks. "It's him," Calvin whispered. "It's really him." Maple, still in Nora's arms, let out a low purr. Then, with surprising agility, she leapt down and walked to the edge of the fence. She sat, tail curled neatly around her paws, eyes steady on the two bobcats tumbling through the snow. She watched for a long time. Calvin knelt beside her. He didn't touch her, didn't interrupt, just watched with her. And when Bodhi finally looked up, fur dusted with snow, eyes bright with recognition, he didn't run to the fence. He just stared. Maple blinked, slowly, once, then turned away, as if to say, "My work here is done." The sanctuary let them stay for an hour, long enough to watch the brothers reunite, chase each other through the snow-dusted enclosure, and curl together in the sun like they'd never been apart, long enough to make it hurt. Calvin leaned against the fence, fingers curling through the wire. Nora stood beside him, arms crossed tightly, as if trying to keep her heart from falling out. "He looks different already," she whispered. He did. Bodhi's movements had changed. Sharper, wilder. Asher, his brother, brought something out in him that Maple never could. The wilderness in his blood. It was both beautiful and cruel. Mira approached from behind, her boots crunching softly in the gravel. "We'll keep them in transitional care for a while," she said. "Let them bond. Watch for signs of aggression, stress. But they're strong. Might even be candidates for soft release next year if all goes well." Calvin nodded, swallowing the knot in his throat. You'll keep us updated?" "Of course. We encourage visitation. You're part of his imprint. That doesn't just vanish." They walked back to the truck in silence. Maple trotted behind them, her pace unhurried, tail low. She hadn't made a sound since the moment Bodhi turned away from the fence. That night at the cabin felt heavier than usual. Not empty, but quieter. Maple curled into her favorite chair without prompting. Calvin sat across from her, staring at the fireplace long after the last ember died. "I thought it'd feel like a victory," he said aloud. Nora looked up from where she was folding laundry. "It is, but it's the kind that breaks you open before it heals you." Calvin nodded. He was never ours to keep. Maple lifted her head then, locking eyes with him. A slow blink. Deliberate. Knowing. The next morning they found her curled in Bodhi's crate, nestled into the plaid shirt that still held his scent. Her purr was soft, like the echo of something once fierce and now fading. They didn't disturb her. Weeks passed. Snow melted. The creek behind the cabin began to flow again. Life returned to its slower rhythm, though it never quite returned to what it had been. Every Sunday they made the drive to Highland Pines. And every Sunday, Maple came along, perched by the enclosure, watching as Bodhi and Asher moved together like twin shadows. Sometimes Bodhi would glance toward her, Their eyes would meet. He never came close to the fence again, but he always blinked. The spring thaw brought more than just green back to the hills. It brought warmth to the bones, birdsong in the mornings, and the slow return of color to a world that had been white and gray for months. At Highland Pines, Bodie and Asher thrived. The staff sent updates weekly, photos of the brothers sunbathing on flat rocks, videos of them stalking each other through tall grass, clips of their mock hunts. Calvin and Nora watched everyone with equal parts joy and ache. Maple always sat nearby when the videos played. She never reacted, never made a sound. But when Bodie appeared on screen, she would blink, once, slowly, and then return to stillness. There was a peace in that, a closing loop. One afternoon in early May, they drove out to the sanctuary for a longer visit. It was warmer now, and the air smelled like earth and wild mint. Calvin brought the old plaid shirt with him, folded neatly in the passenger seat. It no longer smelled like Bodie, just laundry soap and thyme, but it felt right to bring it anyway. When they arrived, Mira met them with a quiet smile. "They're thriving," she said. "We're prepping them for soft release in the fall. Low human contact, gradual habitat transition. It's going to be hard on them, but they're ready." Calvin nodded slowly, fingers tightening around the folded shirt. Mira opened the gate to a private viewing area. It overlooked the brothers' enclosure, a wide field dotted with logs, brush, and the early signs of new life. They spotted the bobcats near the back fence, stretched beneath a tree. Asher was asleep, but Bodie was awake, grooming a paw, his ears twitching with the breeze. Calvin unfolded the shirt and laid it on the ground near the fence. A small gesture, a quiet goodbye. Minutes passed. Then Bodie stirred. He lifted his head, sniffed the air. He didn't move at first, just watched. And then, slowly, he padded toward the fence. He didn't cry, didn't chuff. He simply stood there, inches away, eyes locked with Calvin's. Maple stepped forward. For a moment, nothing happened. Just three creatures, separated by wire and fate. Then Bodie bent his head, pressed his nose to the fence, and exhaled. A long, slow breath. Calvin knelt down, his hand resting near the spot where Bodie's breath had touched the mesh. He didn't reach through, didn't try to reclaim what was never his to keep. "You found your place," he whispered, "and we found ours too." Bodie turned, trotted back toward his brother, and disappeared into the grass. Maple sat down beside the folded shirt, curling her tail around her paws. She blinked once, and purred. They didn't visit the sanctuary as often after that, not because the bond had faded, but because it had changed. Calvin and Nora understood something now. Their role had never been to keep Bodie. Their job was to catch him when he fell, to carry him through the dark, and to let him go when the light returned. Life at the cabin settled into a quieter rhythm again. Calvin took on more local rescue calls, an injured owl, a deer caught in fencing. Nora reopened her ceramic studio in the barn, hands in clay, music playing softly in the afternoons. And Maple. She aged. Not all at once, but visibly. The spring in her step softened. Her long fur grayed around the muzzle. She spent more time in the sunspot by the window, or curled in the crate where Bodie used to sleep. Though she never cried, never searched, just watched the trees sway and the birds flit past. One morning, months later, a letter arrived. Handwritten. Mira's careful print filled the page.